stranger's reflection. A man sat in the cafe across from the harbour, his back to the windows that let in the sharp morning light. The smell of salt water and diesel drifted in from the boats, and he could hear the slap of the waves against the docks. He stirred his coffee and let the spoon rest on the saucer. It was too early for tourists, but some fishermen lingered over their breakfasts, speaking in low voices. He could feel their eyes on him now and then. He glanced at his watch. It was 7:15. He wasn't meeting her until 8, but he liked to arrive early, to sit and think about what he would say and what he wouldn't. He had known for a long time this meeting was coming, and now that it was here, he couldn't decide whether to be relieved or regretful. He reached into his coat pocket and took out the letter she had sent him, unfolding it slowly. It had arrived 3 weeks ago, and he had read it so many times the creases were beginning to tear. She hadn't said much in it. She never did say much, even when they were together. Just that she was coming to the city and thought they should meet. After all this time, she had written, and he could picture her expression when she wrote it. The way her lips tightened when she was being practical. The man folded the letter and put it away again, then glanced at his watch. 7:15 still. He picked up his cup and took a sip, then set it down again. The door to the cafe opened, and he saw her in the reflection of the window behind the counter. She stood for a moment, then moved toward him, her footsteps quiet on the wooden floor. She was wearing a grey coat that fell just past her knees, and her hair was shorter than he remembered. She stopped at his table, and he stood. "Hello, Anna," he said. "Hello, Paul," she said, and she gave him a small, guarded smile. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit down." She unbuttoned her coat and draped it over the back of the chair before sitting down. He waited for her to settle before he sat again. A waitress came by and Anna ordered tea. They waited in silence until the waitress left. "You look well," Paul said. "You too," she replied. She looked at him with those eyes of hers, blue-grey, like the sky before a storm. "It's been a long time." "Yes." She turned her gaze toward the window, where the masts of the boats rocked slowly in the harbour. "I didn't think I'd ever come back here," she said. "You always said you wouldn't." She nodded. "I suppose people change." Paul picked up his coffee cup again, but didn't drink. He set it back down and said, "What brought you back then?" Anna glanced at him, then back to the window. "There are things I needed to take care of. Those ends." She folded her hands in her lap. "And I wanted to see you." He waited for her to continue, but she didn't say more. Her tea arrived and she thanked the waitress, then reached for the cup and took a small sip. He noticed her hands were steady, and he didn't know whether that made him feel better or worse. "You never wrote back," she said suddenly, her voice quiet. He glanced down at the table. "I didn't know what to say." She raised her eyebrows slightly, a trace of amusement in her expression. You didn't have to say anything. A word or two would have been enough. He looked up at her. And what would I have said, Anna? That I missed you? That I was angry with you? He shook his head. I didn't know how I felt, and I didn't think it would matter to you. It would have, she said, and her tone was softer now. But it doesn't matter anymore, I suppose. Paul leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He studied her face, searching for something familiar, but it was like looking at a photograph of someone he'd once known. She was the same, and yet not the same. The lines near her eyes were deeper, and there was a distance in her expression that hadn't been there before. Why did you really come back? He asked. She hesitated, then said, I suppose I wanted to know if I'd made the right choice. He felt a tightness in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. And did you? I don't know, she said, and there was a hint of bitterness in her voice. You can't ever really know, can you? Paul looked out the window. A fishing boat was heading out to sea, its engine rumbling. He thought about the times they had walked together along the harbour, how she used to say she would never be satisfied with staying in one place for too long. She had always wanted to see the world, and he had always wanted to build a life. No, he said quietly, I suppose you can't. Anna stirred her tea absently. Do you still paint? She asked. Not much, he replied. I sold the studio a few years ago. She looked at him surprised. You sold it? But you always said you'd keep it no matter what. Things change, he said, and there was a note of finality in his voice. It was too much to keep up, and I wasn't painting enough to make it worthwhile. She nodded slowly as if she understood, but he could see the question in her eyes, the same one he'd asked himself 100 times. When had he stopped being the man who held on to things? You could have told me, she said, almost to herself. He shook his head. What good would it have done? You were already gone. The silence stretched between them, and it was filled with all the words they hadn't said, all the moments they hadn't shared. She looked down at her cup, then back up at him. I did love you, she said quietly. You know that, don't you? Paul met her gaze, and there was a sadness there that he recognized as his own. I know, he said, but sometimes love isn't enough. She looked away, and he saw her swallow hard. I should go, she said, reaching for her coat. He didn't try to stop her. She stood, and he rose to his feet as well. She put on her coat and glanced at him one last time. I'm glad we talked, she said. So am I. She gave him a small, sad smile, then turned and walked toward the door. He watched her go, watched the way she moved with that quiet grace of hers, and for a moment he thought she might turn back. But she didn't. She opened the door and stepped out into the sunlight. Paul stood there for a long time after she had gone. He reached into his pocket and took out the letter again, unfolding it slowly. He read the last line, the one she had written in her careful, measured handwriting. "I hope you're well." He folded the letter and placed it on the table beside his empty cup. Then he turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps quiet on the wooden floor. Outside, the light was sharp, and the wind blew in from the harbour, carrying with it the smell of salt water. He walked to the edge of the docks and looked down at the water, where his reflection wavered and broke with each ripple. He could barely recognize the face staring back at him, and for a moment he felt as if he were looking at a stranger. He turned away and walked along the harbour, his hands in his coat pockets. The city seemed unchanged, and yet it was different in ways he couldn't describe. He wondered if she would remember it the same way he did, or if it would seem like a place from another life. He reached the end of the docks and stopped. There was a small cafe there, an old place where they used to sit and watch the boats together. He hadn't been back there since she'd left, and he almost kept walking. Something made him pause. He glanced over his shoulder, back toward the harbour, then turned and walked into the cafe.